Hi, so good to be back here. I'm John, he's Jeremy. Father, son. So we're going to do our podcast, and this is how it begins. Hi, it's Thursday, and welcome to a very special edition of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. Jeremy and I talk about what's on our mind at the moment, and we don't often agree with each other, but we do it civilly, especially since I need a ride home back to New Hartford. So, first of all, let me begin by saying congratulations to the Center for Community Studies. Congratulations to SUNY Jefferson, Jefferson Community College, take your pick, for having the foresight to understand really the importance of opinion research. We want to talk about 5 minutes or so about the importance of the work that we both are engaged in, and then I think we're going to talk about the election a little bit, but you would probably guess that. But first of all, thank you to Joel, of course, who I've known this many years, and to Don Alexander, who is indeed a good friend and a real visionary. One of the most impressive fellows that I have met, period, and certainly very impressive fellow here, among a really outstanding group of leaders in the Watertown, Fort Drum Impact area. At the same time, thank you to John Deans and to Dick Halpin and to Ray Peterson. Your remarks grounded me, made me understand what it is that you have done. I've seen some of your studies over the years, and they're great. But Ray in particular struck a note with me and inspired me, because I heard from you, all of the speakers actually, that you're going to be introducing more social science into your work. And that reminds me of the theme that I've been working on for so many years. It's been 40 years now, and that I write about in my book, which incidentally is for sale. And that is that we use numbers, but we don't poll numbers. We poll people. And it's really very important for us to understand that we want opinions and we want attitudes, but ultimately what we're trying to get at are the values that drive people's behavior, that define who they are, that help them make the decisions that they make. So that when we ask questions, we're asking questions of human beings. And we don't want to know just, do you support this local ordinance or oppose this ordinance? Do you support this law or oppose this law? But when we ask the question, we want to attach that policy to a value. So what about abortion? We'll ask, do you agree or disagree that abortion is tantamount to manslaughter? And we'll get a majority of people who will say it is tantamount to manslaughter. And the same majority will say, but a woman has a right to choose. Are people stupid or are they fickle? No, they're conflicted. They have deep-seated values. Some have deep-seated values on both sides. And that's what's important to know if you're running a campaign or if you're making a policy choice. The same thing with guns, the same thing with social issues. We need to understand who people really are and what drives them. So it's not just a fleeting opinion here or an attitude there. It's what makes us who we are. And a community is actually a composite of individual values. And so it's very important to know what drives that community. What you do is so important. So important for developers, who for years would just come into a community and say, I like this piece of land, I'll do the engineering study, let's build a mall, let's build a road, an access road, without ever really asking fundamentally about to the people. What is it that you want? What do you want your community to be? What's your vision? What are your aspirations? Not only for yourself, but for your community. And honestly, that is so important. So I look forward to the next 25 years. I'll be 101 when I come back. And I really would love to see social science. I'd love to see humanities people involved in a center like this. So again, congratulations. Fellow historian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do, because I think only a few people in the audience may have heard me mention this, but it's amazing to me how life has this tendency to come full circle. And in this year, 2024, was a very big year for not only this edition of the polling firm, the family business, John Zogby Strategies, but also for my role in the leadership. And to come back to Watertown in that pivotal year, for me, for us, for our business, for the nation, is very symbolic and powerful, because this is where it all began. And I was just 6 years old when my dad came home and started talking about this place, Watertown, kid, from West Utica. And probably wouldn't surprise you that, a 6-year-old boy often found public school very boring. And so when my dad would say, "Hey, do you want to come on a business trip with me?" And of course, I would already be in the car by the time he finished saying that. He would bring me to Watertown, and there was a coin shop that I loved to go to, and there were restaurants that we went to, and I went to business meetings. And so this is where it all began for me. And of course, when I was 6 and 7 and 8 coming up here, I couldn't have told anybody what was going on. But as somebody said to me, through osmosis, that was the beginning. And it's wonderful to be back here.
So Watertown's very special to us. You got to play hooky, which was nice. Yeah. All right, so we got this thing going on, okay, every 4 years, and this is truly an Armageddon election, in the sense that I don't think either side is really prepared to accept the victory of the other side. So I'm getting a lot of invitations to do media and to analyze election night results, and I'm telling people, we're not going to know anything the night of the election, simply because not all the votes are going to be counted, right? Just logistically, they're just not going to be counted. And secondly, because, at least for now, it looks like a close election, and it may stay that way, right to the very end. So here we are nationally. At this moment in time, the average of the polls has Kamala Harris leading nationally by about 2 percentage points. That means that's not really a lead at all, for 2 reasons. One is that's well within the margin of sampling error. But secondly, because of the way the Electoral College is structured, Democrat really needs to be leading by about 3, probably 3.5 percentage points in the national popular vote in order to win the Electoral College. Because there are going to be millions of excess votes for Democrats coming out of California, coming out of New York, coming out of Illinois, coming out of navy blue states. By the same token, the same averages of polls will show Donald Trump is leading in 4 out of 7. One that was just published on Sunday, the average of the 7 battleground states, Trump has pulled into the lead in 6 out of 7 of the battleground states. Not one of those leads is more than 1.5 percentage points. Most of them are under 1 percentage point. That's not a lead. So despite the conflict, despite the disruption, despite the conflict and misogyny and all the negativity that's out there, we are at equilibrium. We are at balance. A disruptive Armageddon and at the same time Zen moment in American history. I would be a fool, and I'm not, at least anymore, to tell you I know what's going to happen, because I honestly don't. And anybody that says that they do honestly doesn't know what's going to happen. So with that said, I'd like you to share some of your thoughts, and then I'll come back and give my thoughts on what each candidate needs to do in order to win.
Yeah. Well, coming from a Lebanese background, there's an old Arab proverb that says, "He who predicts is a fool." And Zogby's found their way into the business of polling. But the fact of the matter is, the reality is there's really only, in my opinion, I'm sure you would agree, and I think any pollster should agree with this, that the only time that you're predicting is in the final poll. And that any other poll before that is tracking. And so, you start out a year before for, say, a presidential cycle like we're in, and you start with the popular vote, and you poll and you poll and you poll, and then you go to your data and you try to see, does anything look different? Are there any demographics that seem more excited? But you got to be prepared to throw that out, because as we march forward with time, events happen. And an unmistakable trend is that as we march forward in time, the world is getting more chaotic. And society and the country are getting more chaotic. I mean, the events are happening so quickly, and they're so much bigger. And so you continue tracking the polling. And so you're looking at the popular vote, and then say maybe you get to the summer, and then you start looking at the battleground states, right? But look at what happened this summer. It's unbelievable. I mean, I'm only 41, but I can only really think of in modern election history, maybe 1968 as chaotic as what we're seeing. And a lot of eerie similarities between 68 and 24, a lot of eerie similarities. And so assassinations, a Kennedy involved, a sitting president stepping down. And so that's what we're dealing with. And starting with June 27th, Joe Biden and the performance during the debate, which was shocking, sent the Democratic Party into an extreme low. And what you then saw in those coming 2 weeks, those following 2 or 3 weeks, was essentially Democratic voters in what I would say, James Carville called it, he called it, when Kamala stepped on the scene, he called it a sugar high. I call it an emotional high. But before it got to the emotional high, it was a low. And so we saw this, and then we saw the Trump assassination. So you're trying to figure out what's going to happen, and you have some people trying to say that they think they know what's going to happen in July, and in August, and in September, and we don't know. And here we are 2.5 weeks. And one thing I will say, and maybe it sounds like now I'm not predicting who's going to win, but I will say confidently that between now and Election Day, I expect something major to happen. And that could be on the geopolitical front, as we see what's happening in the Middle East, with Israel engaged now with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, engaged in Lebanon, engaged in Gaza, and now the potential for Iran and Israel to go head to head. It's possible. What would happen? That would impact the global economy like unbelievably, okay? And then there's Ukraine, and then there's Taiwan. There's the economy. The economy, now, one could argue that the Federal Reserve may lower interest rates maybe gas prices can come down, but there's still, you can feel some reverberations that could potentially happen. And there's a lot of things. I mean, socially, culturally, October surprises, releases about Harris, about Trump. Of course, probably we've heard everything we need to know about Trump, but some major bombshells. And so back to my point that the only time that a pollster should be predicting is in that final poll after they've seen all of this play out, after they've tracked it, and they say, I think I have an idea of what the voter turnout is going to look like. And right now, all these polls are tight. Any poll that's showing Harris ahead by 5, or like Rasmussen saying that Republicans are ahead by 2, which is significant because typically there are more Democratic voters than Republicans. I don't buy those. I think it's up in the air.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of issues. Let me start with the most general and then turn it into a funnel and get more specific. Broadly speaking, make no mistake about it, we are living in the midst of a revolution. No small revolution, one of those epical revolutions like when feudalism ended and was replaced by capitalism, and all of its pieces, all the pieces of feudalism fell apart and all of the pieces of capitalism arose. The difference is that revolution took place over hundreds of years. Today, we are seeing, because of rapid technological changes that are necessitated in the workplace, in the functioning of institutions, in political parties, in government, in church, in not-for-profits, and so on, that need to adjust to these rapid changes. It's all taking place in real time. But we humans, in this instance, we Americans, we have so many adjustments that need to be made. And even in that transition from feudalism to capitalism, there was a phenomenon called cultural lag, that the institutions of necessity changed. And there were renaissances and church reformations and enlightenment thinking and so on, but there were tens of millions of people who were still lagging behind and finding it impossible to adjust and were reacting. And so we are at an inflection point in this country with this election. And neither side really represents that fundamental revolutionary change. Both candidates, both political parties, are what I call a but generation. And I don't mean with 2 T's, I mean with 1. We need to make change, but this is the way we've always done things. And so the antidote to that, and I've written extensively on this over the years, the antidote are millennials and Gen Z, who are not steeped in older institutions, are not tied down by older ways of doing things, are of necessity making changes in the workplace, making changes in society to reflect the new realities on the ground. Now that's the broad stroke. Let's get through the funnel and get specific here. This election will hinge on turnout by 18 to 34-year-old voters. Period. When you look at polls, don't simply look at the overall numbers. Get down to young voters. Here's the strategy that's taking place. First of all, on the Democratic side, Harris. Back in 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were neck and neck, tied, until about Friday before the election. And then Saturday before the election, Obama, who had been underperforming among young voters, we started to see him tick up in his support. And undecided young voters started tilting towards Obama, so that by the day before the election, Obama was polling 61% of young voters, which is about where he needed to be. He won 61% of young voters. But it was a lower turnout among young men. It was a higher turnout among young women, and 73% of young women supported Obama. That's what put him over the top. So now, fast forward to 2024, this is where we're at. As Jeremy pointed out, Joe Biden was underperforming among key elements of the winning Democratic coalition. Underperforming among blacks, especially black men, young black men. Underperforming among Hispanics. Underperforming among young voters. Kamala Harris comes in, and without getting all the reasons why, she changed the conversation. Mental acuity and age were no longer an issue that was off the boards, and you started to see Kamala Harris making gains and bringing back large numbers of those key elements of the Democratic coalition. So instead of polling a measly 55% among blacks, she's polling now over 80% of blacks, but still not where she needs to be. Instead of like Biden polling mid-40s among Hispanics, she's up there polling into the 60s, but not where she needs to be. But what I'm focusing on, and this is the key question, she is trouncing Trump among young women. And of course, the number one issue is reproductive rights. Gaza is also in the top 3 issues of young women, and she's not there yet. And it's among the reasons why you have double-digit undecided voters among young women. 10, 12, 14%. If that means they're not going to turn out to vote, that means she's in trouble. Flip side, real quick, I want to get back to you.
You're good.
Is when you hear J.D. Vance talk about childless cat lovers and Donald Trump saying abortion, women, you don't have to worry your pretty little faces about abortion ever again. They're not talking to women. They're talking to guys. And they're talking to guys who don't, this is not pejorative or elitist at all. This is backed by polling and by studies. Young men are not sure of how to be a man in what they perceive more and more as a female-dominated world. And that's particularly a crisis among young black men. We saw as much as 32% of young black men supporting Trump. Why? Because they were saying he's the baddest dude in town. And we want to shake things up because we're falling behind. And women are making gains. They're making gains from 3rd grade reading tests to high school behavior, truancy, to college admissions, to college education, to career path, and men feel like they're sliding. And so watch the campaign, because in many ways, what you're going to be seeing is the boys versus the girls. And a key number is if you see undecideds among young women shrinking, that means they're going to turn out to vote. If you see undecideds among young men and probably young black men shrinking, that means that they're going to vote for Trump and that Trump wins.
Yeah. Wow. That's very in-depth. Very in-depth demographic analysis.
I'm thinking of doing it for a living, you know.
You know, I would say that in listening to all this, and I brought this up on the podcast, but it's so stark right now, is I don't think in our election history there has ever been two candidates who are more polar opposite, not just in terms of messaging, but in actual terms of their representation of the demographics that they represent. Trump is older. He's getting close to 80. He's white. He's a man. He came from a privileged background. He represents conservative America. Rural America loves him. And then, I mean, I could probably go even further than that. Harris is a woman of color. She's probably an older Gen X, member of Generation X.
Yeah, not a boomer.
She's not a boomer,
yeah.
So she's the next generation down. From the West Coast, Trump from the East Coast. Man versus woman, black or white versus non-white, liberal versus conservative, East Coast, West Coast, young versus old. I mean, in every which way you can think of. These are two polar opposite candidates demographically. And then you throw into the mix the hyperpolarization that we have in this country. And then you throw into the mix that in 2016, the election was contested. Let's not forget that what begot 2020, according to my estimation, and the denial of the election results was born in the reaction of Clinton, a great deal of the media, the national media, and then down to the message filtered down to the Democratic voters to say that Trump is not legitimate. He was elected by a foreign adversary through election mingling, and that he is the enemy. And then we got to 2020. So we had two elections in a row that were essentially contested. And now we're heading into this third with these polar opposite candidates representing polar opposite demographics. And are we going to get to another situation like that? We'll talk about that maybe in the next segment. But I cannot help but notice that as a backdrop. Okay? So let's get back to issues and turnout. I'm reminded of a graph that Pew put together in looking at generations. And if you love data like we do, it would be a good thing to, I think if you just Google Pew Research and election turnout by age cohort or something like that. And the thing that stands out is the 18 to 29-year-olds in 2008 and how they just shot up. And so to your point, if they are harnessed and they turn out, well, they turn out. But if they are not harnessed, they sleep in on election day. And if they sleep in on election day, we can imagine what the consequences or what the outcome of that is. And so that's very true that Harris has the 18 to 29-year-old vote in her favor, particularly coming from women. J.D. Vance and Trump are carving their way into the men. There's this whole phenomenon going on with men, as you alluded to. Somewhere in the 90s, it seemed to be that the culture started to focus more on girls and boys were feeling left out. And, boys were more the sources of problems. And here we are, we're getting into a world where for the last 20 years, women have made amazing advancements in the workplace. I mean, I understand there's still a gap, but if we look at that in the long term of history and we see whether it's Wall Street, whether it's Silicon Valley, even now most recently programming, and if you work at places like Google, I mean, they are hiring women, I don't want to say left and right, but representationally, I would definitely agree with that. And so Fortune 500 companies, larger companies, and so now we're getting into this strategy that's, the battle of the sexes, especially among the young. And so that is going to play a major role. But let us not forget the independent vote and what the independent vote can do to an election. And because they went towards Trump enough that gave Trump the edge in the battleground states in 2016, hence why he won. But then in 2020, they moved for Biden. And they moved for Biden, in the words of Trump, bigly. And that was enough to seal the deal for Biden. And so watch the independent vote in the polls. And right now it looks like Harris has the edge with them, but Hillary Clinton had the edge with them too in 2016. But that final week where James Comey came out with his indictment for Hillary, and then there were this phenomenon known as the Hillary Clinton email leaks, which were, timed within just a few days before the election. I have no doubt in my mind that had a massive impact on the independent voters and their last-minute decision for Trump, because prior to that, a lot of the polls were showing Hillary with a larger lead, and then that closed. And so that was what we call the October surprise. And I alluded to this earlier. I said I do expect a big event to happen within the next 2.5 weeks. This is the month of October surprises. And that the gentleman, Mr. Lichtman, who predicts all the elections, he was quoted as saying that he thinks that's a myth. Well, I don't really know where he's coming up with that one. I could go back 4 or 5 cycles and pinpoint to you key moments in late October that had an impact on the election. We're waiting for more to come.
Look, thank you, everybody. It's really great to be back here, and really great to introduce to you my very, very smart son. I'm very proud of him.